Hello, welcome back to English 340. We're getting near the end here. This is the last week of our second module on Renaissance and early 17th century literature. Next week will be a take-home exam, and then we will take our brief sojourn through the 18th century, and that will be it for your grand tour of English literature from time immemorial until the beginning of Romanticism. So today we're doing books. This week we're doing books 2 and 9 of Paradise Lost, and I urge you to read them slowly, read them out loud, and savor the music. Look for your verb. Try to figure out what the main clause is in your sentence, and just let the sort of story carry you along, because there's a kind of narrative pace to it. I think that makes that gives you a through line to follow. And in this first video, I'm going to just briefly go over some of the terminology that I introduced last week, and the terminology that I'll be introducing or reintroducing this week for the study of Paradise Lost. I think it's important to understand the concepts, and I thought I'd just take a few minutes to go over those with you. I will make videos that I'll make them as brief as I ever can. That can take you more deeply into the readings and into selected passages. But what I want to do in this short video is to introduce you to some of the concepts that can help you navigate this difficult text. Last week, we were introduced to the terms interregnum and restoration. This is a historical. These are historical terms referring to those times in history that John Milton was writing, and Margaret Cavendish for that matter. The interregnum was that period between 1649 and 1660 when England either had no king or it had a king in exile in France, depending on how you look at it, and it was ruled by a faction of theocratic Puritans, first as a commonwealth, a kind of religious republic that they tried to found along the lines of the rule of the judges in the Old Testament of the Bible. And then finally, in 1653, Oliver Cromwell declared himself Lord Protector and essentially ruled as a king, and even might have set up his son Richard Cromwell as the monarch if Richard Cromwell hadn't sucked so much. Pardon my language. Anyway, we discussed the idea of utopia, the imaginary good society, and this is in reference to Margaret Cavendish. Then we talked about the features of the genre of epic, and I invite you to review those as we continue our sampling of Paradise Lost. A lot of the same things: epic simile, in medias res, the long speeches. All of these are supernatural and human interacting. All of these are features of Paradise Lost. I talked also about these stylistic features: hypotaxis versus parataxis, right? And hypotaxis is a kind of way of ordering sentences, ordering your language that depends upon heavy subordination, right? I went to the mall in order that I might meet my friends and we would go to the arcade together where we would play a game, right? That's hypotaxis. All those different parts are stuck together using subordinating conjunctions. That, for, where. Everything is a sort of logical relationship where it's ordered one under the other in a kind of hierarchy of main and subordinate clauses. That's where we get hypotaxis from. Hypo means under, like a hypodermic needle goes under the skin, or hypothermia means your body temperature is under where it should be, as opposed to parataxis, which is a different kind of way of ordering sentences. I went to the mall. I met my friends. We went to the arcade. We played some games. You can tell I grew up in the 80s. But that's parataxis, and para, it means here that they're alongside each other, right? So that's the difference between hypotaxis and parataxis. We talked about theodicy, and that's going to be important today too. This week, recording the lectures today, so I say today, but you'll be watching them all week, hopefully, and reading all week. Theodicy is an argument why is there evil in the world if God is all-powerful and good? This is one of the basic theological questions that has been explored, particularly in the monotheistic religions, the Abrahamic religions of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, because what these religions share is a belief in a creator God who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good. So from a human perspective, that presents problems. Why are children born with spinal bifida? Why is there war? Why is there hunger? Why is there suffering? Why does sunlight give me skin cancer, but it also gives me vitamin D? Like, what's up with the world? And attempts to answer that question that have been offered by theologians for a very long time. An argument justifying God's ways to man, as Milton puts it, is called a theodicy. And we're going to see the narrative theodicy of Paradise Lost a bit more this week. Why is it that God lets sin and death enter the world? Why is it that he allows human beings to fall? Why is it that they get punished? And all of that. That's part of what Paradise Lost is all about. So that's last week's terminology. This week's terminology, a few of these are terms that we've encountered before, but are so important and so crucial to this epic poem that we're going to revisit them. And those are allegory, focalization, and Christian humanism. And some new terms. One is prelapsarian, and the other is level of style. Honestly, I might have introduced level of style to you before. I can't remember. I might not have introduced focalization before. I can't remember. But I think I did when we were talking about Beowulf. So we're kind of reaching back to however many weeks ago it was that we were working on Beowulf and some of the earlier material in this. Because Beowulf is, in a way, it's one of the other great epics in this course, and it's also one that explores in some ways the problems of evil and pride, etc. So without further ado, let's take a close look at some of these terms, and I'm going to use them as a way of introducing this week's reading as an overview. One of the significant things that happens in Book 2 of Paradise Lost is that as Satan is attempting to leave hell in order to go on his mission to corrupt humankind, he gets to the gates of hell and finds that it is guarded. It is guarded by death and sin. And we'll talk a bit more about that encounter, but the important thing here is that sin and death are both, unlike Satan, who, from the Christian perspective, is, for lack of a better word, Satan is a person, right? I mean, he's an angel, but he's an individual who can make agreements, break agreements, who has personal loyalties. He's a force of temptation, he's a force of evil, but he's not the personification of evil. He is an evil angel. He is the foremost evil angel, and in some ways has allegorical characteristics, but isn't altogether an allegory. This is not true of sin and death. Sin and death, pictured here, there's sin. Above the waist, she is a lovely lady, as she's described in Paradise Lost. And below the waist, she is a pack of howling monsters. And this represents both her allegorical nature, right? Sin will devour and wound you, but it can be attractive at the same time, right? This is her visual representation is part of her allegory. And there's death, a grim, foreboding, evil specter holding a dart that will kill you. And what we're going to learn is that this is a family, a happy and an unhappy family, and that the relationship between them, between Satan. Here we could see the disfigurement of his angelic. He still has some of his angelical nature, but he's been disfigured. is going to fight with death, but sin intervenes because sin is the daughter of Satan, and Satan and sin have conceived together death. Death is their child, and you can see theologically how this is all coming together. Satan and sin beget death, right? There's a kind of historical truth to this that's being represented by an individual personified family story. And that story is depicted here in William Hogarth's 1740 painting, Sin, Death, and the Devil. So an allegory is a story, poem, or picture with a system of interrelated symbols that form a hidden meaning together, usually religious or moral rather than political, in pre-modern literature. You may be familiar with modern political allegories like Animal Farm or something like that, but they usually have more of a moral or religious nature in older literature. A famous allegory from the 17th century that I sometimes teach in this course was one of the best-selling books in English of all time is John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. And if you grew up in the Baptist faith, you may know this text already because it's still devotional reading for Baptists, because its author, John Bunyan, was a great English Baptist preacher of the 17th century, and it describes the journey of Christian to find salvation, to find safety, and all the sort of temptations and things that he meets along the way in trying to get there. So allegory is a religious mode of storytelling that goes a long way back. And it's part of Paradise Lost, though not everything in Paradise Lost is allegory. And of course, in the traditional Christian way of reading, something can be both historical and allegorical at the same time. The Church Fathers, going back to Gregory the Great at least, teach that the allegorical interpretation of, say, the Adam and Eve story and the historical reading are not mutually exclusive. There's this historical story: Adam and Eve, real people, lived in the Garden of Eden. Eve succumbed to temptation and ate the fruit of the apple, and then she had Adam and Eve, and they fell from grace, and sin and death and all are woe. Now there's an allegorical reading of this, which says that Adam, the male, is our rational nature. I didn't make this up, don't drag me. Adam, the male, is our rational nature, and the spiritual nature. Eve, the woman, is our physical and appetitive, that is desiring, the appetites of the body, rather than the reason, right? And so when reason succumbs to appetite, when reason, through its own will, consents, because will is above it all. Will is sort of identified with the soul in the Christian tradition. And when reason is ruled by the appetite, when the mind is ruled by the body, you fall, right? You sin. And so there are these two layers they're stacked on each other. It's not that one is the real meaning, and that if you unpack the kind of like the storybook version, then you get the real sort of core meaning, although some people interpret it that way. For a lot of the Christian tradition, it's both at the same time, and that in fact God arranges and disposes history and the events within it, both as the unfolding of his sort of providential plan for the world, but also to instruct us. It's both ends. And this is why I think Christianity lends itself to a poetic treatment so often, and there's so much great poetry and narrative about Christian themes, ideas, stories, legends, and so on, because poetry is also about both ends, right? A metaphor is taking two concepts and putting them together and saying it's both this and this at the same time. It's not that one is just substituted for the other. Okay, enough about allegory for the moment. Let's move on to focalization. I think I talked about this with respect to Beowulf. If I did, I didn't do it enough, but I feel like I never do anything enough in this online class because we're not there. But I'm trying my best. Focalization it contains an idea that's probably familiar to you since high school English, at least, if not middle school, which is point of view, right? first-person point of view, you got your third-person point of view, but it also includes the idea of whether that point of view includes the internal and the external, right? So a third-person omniscient point of view, where you could see somebody's inside. You can see. Here's the thing: you could have a third-person omniscient narrator, which in some respects the narrator of Paradise Lost is, but it still can be focalized around one character. That is, the character whose story you follow, whose perceptions are shared with you. And so Satan is, in many respects, the focalized character of the first two books of Paradise Lost. He's the one whose thoughts we have access to. He's the one whose plans, whose ambitions, whose story we follow. Therefore, books 1 and 2 of Paradise Lost are focalized through Satan. Now, it switches in book 3, which unfortunately we don't read, but book 3 has the Council in Heaven. So the focalization shifts. And so it's interesting to watch the way the focalization shifts. In book 9, I think it's interesting to watch how focalization shifts from Adam and Eve together to Eve alone, and then to Satan, and then back to Eve, and then back to Adam, to talk about how the fall affects our sense of ourselves and the world and the way that we connect to each other. So that's focalization. And so there's, internal and external focalization, as well as saying who is it focalized through. So there's more to the idea than just point of view, but it contains that idea. Another idea that we need to revisit when thinking about Paradise Lost is Christian humanism. In some respects, Paradise Lost might be the quintessential work of English literary Christian humanism. Christian humanism, this term is used to define the cultural and historical period that follows the Middle Ages, and it is characterized by an identification with the classical culture, with a particular attention to Greek language and literature, which in that time was rediscovered after centuries in Western Europe. Now, that's been going on for a couple hundred years already by Milton's time, but these things started in Italy and sort of percolated their way up. I have here pictured an example of famous example of what can only be called Christian humanism, Michelangelo's Pietà, this incredible marble statue at St. Peter's Basilica, which shows the Virgin Mary with the body of the crucified Christ between his crucifixion and resurrection, sprawled across her knees, and it's a wonderful contrasting image to other pictures of the Madonna with her child. In its realism, in its anatomical detail, and in the folding of the drapery and in its composition, it is extraordinarily influenced by the statuary, by the marble sculpture of the Greek and Roman world. And so it's a good visual representation of what classical humanism is about in many ways. It's about using the techniques and the motifs of Greek and Roman, which is to say classical art, in order to express Christian themes and ideas. And an epic work inspired by Virgil and Homer, talking about the fall of humanity in the Garden of Eden and the war in heaven, is a great example of Christian literary humanism, and one of England's great contributions to Christian humanism. It's an interesting thing too that Milton is a Puritan, right? And in some respects, he is a staunch Protestant. And comes out of a tradition of strong Protestantism that really saw this kind of thing here, which is in the Vatican, as idolatry. It was very much against making visual images of religious, on religious topics. And this is, something that again runs through it's a theme that runs through the Abrahamic faiths because of the 10 Commandments, right? Thou shalt not make any graven images. There's whole thing in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, about not making idols and not making a visual depiction of God. And this is something that Jews still hold to, and that Muslims really sort of took to a very high degree, or not all kinds of Islam everywhere at all times, of course. There's a number of there's a great tradition of Islamic visual art representing people in Persian traditions and in Indian traditions. But in the classical Sunni Islam of Western Arabia, you don't even represent anything that has a soul. So their visual arts includes calligraphy and images of plants, because plants don't have souls, but no animals, no people. And of course, in Christianity, this whole question on whether you can have images of people or of religious figures has gone back and forth. There was, of course, in the early church, a strong tradition of iconography and like Byzantine. I'm taking an art history course, take a history of Christianity course to get the full version of this. But basically, all through the Middle Ages in the Western Roman Catholic Church, there was a tradition of visual arts that became more and more elaborate. But this gets rejected by the Protestants as idolatry. In the 16th and 17th century in England, you have the sort of the Puritans, as they're called, throwing rocks through stained glass windows and pulling down statues and breaking altarpieces and doing all kinds of things like this. And yet, that tradition of visual culture in Christianity and of allegorical representations of ideas gets textualized. It gets turned into visual imagery in literature. And, one of the great sources for Milton on this is Spenser, Edmund Spenser, who writes a poem called The Fairy Queen, which is enormously influential on Milton, and which I didn't assign this time, but again, that's another text I sometimes assign in this class, and you may be interested in, for your final project, to go and look at Book 1 of The Fairy Queen if you like Christian humanism, allegory, epic. If that's your bag, maybe you want to have a look at Spenser for your final project. He's one of the major canonical figures, and very influential on John Milton, particularly in terms of expressing all these theological ideas through visual imagery and sort of translating the visual culture of Christianity into a visual idiom. Okay, that's a lot I had to say on Christian humanism. Let's talk about just this term. Prelapsarian is one that always confuses people, but Prelapsarian basically refers to anything that's characteristic of the time before the fall of man. Pardon my old-fashioned language, it's an old-fashioned concept. The fall of humanity, if you prefer. The guilt and sin and death of humankind in the Garden of Eden. So that which is prelapsarian refers to what people and the world was like before the fall. It refers to that which is innocent and untouched by sin. It refers to that which is reminiscent of the Garden of Eden. It's from the Latin word lapsus, meaning fall, as in a lapse in judgment. Here's a picture of William Blake, the great romantic poet and artist, who was, like many the Romantics were fascinated with Milton. The neoclassical authors of the 18th century found Milton to be a little bit, what's the word they use? They say a little extra, a little over the top, a little too much. But the Romantics were all about being extra, and they loved Milton's sort of grandeur and over-the-topness. And William Blake, one of the first great Romantic poets, made a series of illustrations of Paradise Lost. And here's Adam and Eve in the garden, just totally unself-conscious. They're naked, they don't care. And there's Satan on the outside looking in like, oh, God, I don't like that. So prelapsarian is a word that we're going to use, especially in discussing Book 9 of Paradise Lost, which is all about how do we write about what it's like to be a human being who doesn't sin or is untouched by sin, is unfallen. If the effects of the fall on our judgment, on our thought, on our appetites are so profound, how can a fallen poet, even one saved and justified by grace, possibly understand what it was like to never have fallen, and to understand why one could go from an unfallen state and in an unfallen state consent to sin. How does that even happen? That's the great puzzle of Paradise Lost that Milton attempts to explore through his narrative. Final concept, or group of concepts, and this is less about theology, and this brings us back to literary style, is this concept of levels of style. This is a distinction in types of writing originating in the Roman rhetorical tradition and observed by medieval and early modern authors. Not romantic authors, not modern authors, but in the period of history when rhetoric was still at the heart of literary education. It was taught that the way that you wrote had to suit the kind of thing that you were writing. And there were 3 levels of style, as we already talked about: low, medium, and high. So the low or plain style is simple, direct, straightforward. It does not rely heavily on figurative language. Colloquial speech and technical writing are different variations of the low or plain style. So comedy features the low style, so will a treatise on the astrolabe. The middle style, it hopped in there, uses devices for effect more than ornamentation and strives for clarity more than impressiveness. It is accessible but not informal or colloquial. It is suited to oratory, history, legal writing, philosophy, and autobiography. In some ways, academic prose that you're supposed to be taught to write here at the university is the successor to the medium style. It should be engaging, it should be clear, but it shouldn't be fancy. You shouldn't use bigger words than you need to. It's kind of like right-sized, you know? And then finally, there is, and this is this is the important one for what we're talking about here, the high or grand style, which is highly formal, highly ornamented with poetic and rhetorical devices, suited to epic and tragedy. Paradise Lost is of the higher grand style. And what I've included here, again, is an image. This is a Baroque altarpiece from St. John's Cathedral in Malta, and it's roughly contemporaneous with Milton's poem, and it is an example of Baroque style, right? And Baroque comes between sort of neoclassical Renaissance and then the neoclassicism of the Rococo of the 18th century, and it's this it's an aesthetic of inclusion, we might say, of throw everything in there, decorate every surface, and make it as fancy as you possibly can. And there is an overall design to it. There's an overall shape. It's not random, but it's not sort of simple and purified and refined in the way that like modernist aesthetics is, or like thoroughgoingly classicizing aesthetics. Think of a Greek temple, or like a modernist skyscraper, like the UN building or something like that, right? There's a sense of removing all ornament, removing everything that isn't essential to the design. The aesthetic of inclusion, like a Gothic or a Baroque church, is like the grand style in that you want everything ornamented, you want to sort of include everything, all these similes, all the big words. It is also characterized by, to bring us back full circle here, a hypotactic style, like that, that opening line of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world, with all our woe, till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat. Sing, heavenly muse, right? There's all these layers of subordination in that sentence. It's not sort of just like set next to each other and like also do this, also do that, also do that. It's also about this. No, it's hypotactic, and that's part of the grand style too. So, I guess this video is meant really to, as a front end for your reading, to sort of orient you and give you some ideas and concepts with which to think about your reading and sort of organize it in your own mind. And hopefully today, but definitely by Wednesday, the rest of the videos should be up that will take us into particular key crucial passages and help us unpack them and see what Milton's doing, both at the grand level, but also at the level of individual lines and passages, where as a poem, it's really frequently doing its work. So I know you guys have the ability and chops to get through this and to appreciate it and say something meaningful about it, and I look forward to discussing it with you. Be well.